recently I've been talking to a student after we went to a theatre performance that had been dealing with the questions of Jews and the genocide during fascism. And I said there's always something, some feeling of being guilty, even for me, having been fighting against fascism after 45 as young men, and being born actually after all this stuff happened. Now she said there's no reason you shouldn't feel guilty. And of course, there is no reason, but there is still some feeling of being volens part of this society, part of this nation. And it is a feeling that cannot be properly described or made clear to somebody. And probably all have something like it, independent of the country from which we come, but there are certain national features and they are important, even if we are fighting against them. We are stuck, and this is a very important point, to the nation state, to the idea of nation that is going throughout modernity and coining actually identity. So on the one hand, there is no reason to feel guilty. There is definitely no real guilt. But at the same time, there is something of a national identity. And we have to deal with this contradiction of there is a national identity, even if we don't identify with it. Now, this is important as well when we look at history, looking at the different features, the long-term development, as Baudin said, the coining of a character that is nearly impossible to overcome. And then something else, the medium term, the history we know, and where we have the dates and the facts, and we look at this. And of course, being important for the identity building to the way we look at this medium term history, we may say is obviously getting clear when we look at past dependency, as political science says it. And then we have the short-term history, the moment that is relevant, where we deal actually with the history, long-term, medium-term. We are not aware of it, but it plays a role, and we are not even thinking about it, although it characterizes all our action. We just act. We don't think about the context. It is just the moment where we act and where we think. Nothing else is important, just the moment, just the location. Now, looking at these long-term issues, I think we may say that something that really characterizes Germanness, if we want to use this term, are some features as liberalism. Of course, we have this liberalism being characteristic for all European countries, at least. But I think with the German Enlightenment, with Kant especially, this plays an especially important role here. It had been the philosophical and the political part of liberalism, or what is called liberalism. We always have to be a little bit careful with these terms and what exactly they mean. In this context of German understanding of liberalism, it had been the emphasis of the individual. The individual as being responsible for him or herself, her came later, but the personal identity being decided, being characterized by this kind of independence and the need that everybody is deciding for himself, is responsible for himself, for herself, and then from there, society is actually considered as an agglomeration of these responsibly acting individuals. As I said, nationalism played, of course, in all European, but as well in non-European countries, a role and still plays. If we look at the shifts in borders and the fight about certain territories today, and actually new states being founded. But in the German understanding, it was especially important before the Reichsgründung, before the foundation of the empire in the 1870s, because it was exactly this point of trying to get this diversity of kingdoms and fiefdoms together under one roof and building this nation state. This was to some extent contradicting, but at the same time complementing strongly the idea of the so-called Stände, the guilds, and the different groups in society that had been their own saying, but where the status actually had been decisive in terms of the allocation of political and social and cultural identity. This had been important, not least if we look at the working class actually opposing later on with industrialization this shift towards modernization. Modernization was, of course, in some way a positive element for the working class in terms of evening work, in terms of different aspects that meant as well that social programs had been developed, that there had been more ideas about social policy coming up, but at the same time it had been the loss of the old securities, the safety that had been known. This is a contradiction we frequently face, that we have on the one hand the security that is known and that we criticize in many cases, but at the same time the fear of something new and this insecurity actually throwing us back then towards something that we know and throwing us back, although we are aware of the limitations of these old systems. One feature of this old traditional system had been the church, and there we find in a way ongoing struggle of the independence of the state from the church. It would be wrong in the strict sense to speak of church states, but there is something where we say the influence of the church, especially the Catholic Church, but later on as well of the Protestant churches, had been so strong that at least we may speak of a quasi-church state. Especially in the social area, hospitals, education, the church played a major role, and as well it played a major role in what can be seen as the foundation of associations. Associations is something that is as well very important when it comes to German identity, because on the one hand you have this huge empire, and at the same time there was this shift or the maintenance of the old identities being in the associations, founding new associations, but at the same time the old pattern of familiarity. The family, of course, not only in Germany, but especially here as well, played an important role in this respect. So it is important to keep in mind that this ongoing hierarchical and segregationist structure of the German state played a huge role ongoing, even if the structures fundamentally changed. I was hesitating to say fundamentally because the old hierarchies still had been in place and had been carried over into the new system. The electoral system had been, of course, something very important as a kind of democratizing democratizing feature of this modernizing society. Although we have to acknowledge that it had been, at the end of the day, only a relatively small number who had been eligible to go to votes, it had been an opening aspect of society, of the German society, where we see at the same time that it had been especially the upper classes, the old ruling classes, maintaining their power and carrying it over. This is not only a structural aspect of the power, maintenance of power, but it is as well something that characterizes the entire idea of what I said, liberalism and individualism, self-responsibility. There's an interesting issue that actually only a small number of people had been eligible and could vote. And there's an interesting reason for it that had been mentioned. And this had been that day laborers and factory workers, domestic servants, and German craftsmen had not been allowed to vote. Now, we can say, of course, this is an exclusion of these people, not giving them the political rights they should be able to claim. But the reasoning behind it was very interesting, I think. And the reasoning was that actually the dependency of these people from, we would say today, their employers, did not allow these people to have their own right, their own voice. It was seen actually that these people had been depending on their employers and thus not allowing them to decide independently. So it was not exclusion, and in a way we can say it was not so much, not primarily an argument against these people who had been excluded, but it had been an argument against those people who kept them in dependencies. Slavedom didn't exist anymore. But the dependency still existed and had been moved on into the new system. We see this in the industrial structure, in the economic structure, where we have the old system of craftsmen and guilds, even in new forms, and where we have had the patriarch patronizing even larger enterprises and being the person who was in control of everything. We see this later on with the Krupp, for instance, building entire towns and systems, societies, if you want, establishing this dependency of workers. You have had a job, you had to buy the money, with the money you earned from your work, you had to buy in the shops offered by Krupp, and you lived in the housing. But as soon as you lost your job, meaning as soon as you had not been considered being reliable, profitable, productive enough, it was not only the work you lost, but it had been the entire system, the entire background that secured, to some extent, at least your life. This contradiction had been as well maintained or elaborated in an extensive system of associations. These associations have been primarily dealing with the so-called social question, providing services and disciplining people, looking after their wealth and health. And wealth meant what had been considered as the psychological well-behaving people. So this is important. This had been maintained, carried over in the associations for everything, for education, for social provisions, for cultural events, and not least in working class, for education, self-education, and acquiring of knowledge. Now this is important because this coined what can be seen later, much later, as the idea of the social state, of ordoliberalism as well, going back to this idea. And it had been strongly linked to the idea of education. The phrase of the Germans being the people of poets and thinkers is a kind of guideline through all this, coming on, moving on from the Enlightenment and moving on in this way of looking at a very early stage at a law, at a regulation for children and young people not being allowed, or regulating at least the hours they had been allowed to work. It was at the same time the obligation to go to school that started already in the first half of the 19th century. And then, of course, later moving on to Stein saying something of a social state. Literally, he was talking about a kingdom of social reforms. This was Stein's idea. This was his idea of reforms, where he wanted to see Germany. And later, I would doubt that it had been Bismarck taking up this idea, but it closely linked and made it possible to continue from there, establishing then what had been called or is called the Bismarckian welfare state, which is actually going on, as I said, back to Itzenplitz, to the Minister of Trade. Wherever it is Bismarck who is seen as the father of this idea, and wherever is something that can be seen actually in the ongoing belief in authorities. This is a very important thing that complements actually this liberalism, individualism, and performing well, being oriented on performance. This was the other side of liberalism and individualism, that only those people who performed well could avail of power, did gain the right to political participation, and so on and so forth. This is important to see the complexity of the entire system, and to see as well the importance, the ongoing importance of education. Usually what we think is that it is especially the social state, the welfare state, that is typical for Germany. I would say, as important as this may be, as in the reflection of stick and carrot, the other side is really the complementing role of education as a means of control, and taking up by the working class as a means of emancipation. Wissen ist Macht, knowledge is power was one of the slogans of the German educational associations from the working class. We have to obtain knowledge to be able to take over power. Different to the French, different to the Russian experiences and orientations. This meant as well that this importance of education had been seen very much, or had been linked very much into the system of federalism, that education had been always a matter of the Länder, of the counties, where important decisions should be taken. I say should be because federalism never worked out in this idea. The independence did exist, but at the same time it had been permanently undermined by the mechanism of centralization of power. Another aspect, even more towards decentralization, had been the self-administration of educational, especially third level educational institutions. Self-administration by those who have been employed there, meaning the academics and as well, to some extent, the administrative stuff, but as well the students. It had been a very differentiated system. It had been very full of contradictions, of course, leaving the main power to the main academics, meaning the professors, but at least it had been an issue of self-administration, linked and complementing the idea of freedom of teaching and research. There was a long dispute about this freedom of teaching and research because it meant that there was no responsibility for researchers. In a way, they could do whatever they wanted to do, and in a way, they could link up with industrial interests and. So the necessary link to practice had not been reflected properly. There was this claim of independence, and at the same time, it actually created, or it opened a door towards dependence. This dependency was later consciously steered in the GDR, where actually there was an obligation to link research and teaching to societal interest. But this was not just a limitation of this freedom, but it was about developing educational and research responsibility. So this was seeing academics as people, as citizens, and being responsible to the society. Part, of course, was the general obligation. Everybody had to go to school. There was no way around this. And the problem was, of course, that this did not overcome the inequalities, because going to school is a matter of financial resources. And it is, on the one hand, the immediate need, it is the loss of income for the family, and it is the ongoing cost of children going to school, not being productive, not contributing to the household income. This is the main system, if you want, as the ideology, the journals that had been established. And it was, of course, something that had been then as well continued, if you want, or complemented by certain institutional provisions. On the one hand, there had been a relatively strong support of certain research institutes. At some stage it had been called the Blue List, where I think it had been 5 research institutes being supported to do fundamental research. It had been not oriented towards immediate success, but it had been the fundamental research which never would provide any results, or where the results would be only a long-term benefit of society, of other researchers, making then other research actually possible. It had been these independent research institutes without the need, in a way, to look for money. These societies split up in different disciplinary groups on biology, on nuclear medicine, on chemistry issues, on law issues, different copyright law, international law, social law, and another point is that we see actually in the Constitution the acknowledgement of the importance of parties and political parties and the mass media as independent bodies being there, and the independence being protected simply because these institutions, and I say institutions, had been seen as an important educational mechanism to support the development of political consciousness, of what I said before, independent thinking in terms of enabling people, enabling citizens to be citizens, and this would be a wording that had been used at the time, enabling them to be citizens and act on their own behalf, on behalf of their consciousness, of their knowledge, of their judgment. Back to Kant, enlightenment means that people are enabled and feel enabled to judge independently according to their consciousness, according to their knowledge, and not being guided, forced by others to decide in a certain way. In this way, it is a kind of circle where you see the old, very old ideas of a society being then transformed and transferred into the modern setting and still being valid. This is the long-term, long history that in a way characterizes German thinking. And this is of course something where even if one had not been even born at a time, the First World War or the Second World War, it is something that is your World War, because it had been your nation. All this being in one way or another responsibility. And this is one of the challenges, if you want, to emancipate from this hyper-individualism, from this way of enlightenment that at some stage actually turned around being the foundation of new dependencies, the foundation of a commitment to truth that did not consider any values anymore. The eclipse of reason by the Frankfurt School, criticizing this narrow-minded rationality in terms of a measurement of what freedom is, instead of understanding really what freedom is as a societal issue where social responsibility is a responsibility not of the individual, but actually responsibility of society for society, where participation is not simply taking part, but as well being part of the society. If we look at Germany today, this, I would say, can be questioned. How many people who is really part of the society in the fullest sense of the meaning?